Last time we learned that to write an account of a great Mediterranean person's childhood required no research, no fact-checking, and no reliable sources in the modern sense. Thus, the evangelists we name Matthew and Luke wouldn't have needed to interview Jesus' parents, or home village, or childhood friends and acquaintances. We discussed how, according to scholars Bruce Molina and Richard Rohrbaugh, almost all the information gospel writers needed for this task could be solidly inferred from Jesus' adult behavior. This was because they, like every ancient person, knew that a great adult must have been great in miniature as a child. So to answer the riddle, how did Matthew and Luke discover the baby Jesus, is understanding how they explored regularly and routinely the adult risen Jesus appearing in visions before them in the Jesus group. Being inspired by God does not transform ancient Mediterranean scribes into 21st century idealized American news reporters. The most important part of the word inspiration is the prefix in. Inspiration happens in history, and in a cultural setting. Imagine that you were an author living long ago in the Mediterranean world. You belong to a culture that has no awareness of human psychological development from children growing to adults. Additionally, you were socialized to believe that children were adults in miniature. And so if you knew of a great heroic adult, whatever heroic or great qualities he had as an adult must have also been present in the same person when he was a child. Now imagine you wrote an account of the hero's infancy and childhood. Why would you need to suddenly morph into a 21st century American journalist or biographer in order to accomplish your task? If you are an ancient Mediterranean storyteller, about 95 to 99% of the information you need will be provided by your image of the adult hero. Then, trained in the art of ancient Mediterranean rhetoric, you will craft an honorable childhood account that mirrors the hero as you know and interpret him in his adult form. If you are a late 1st century Jesus group author writing about Jesus' childhood, about 5 to 1% of your data will come from embarrassing stuff. This would be material passed down through the Jesus group and from its enemies, stuff neither yourself nor the Jesus tradition would ever invent. Examples would be like his lowly village peasant status, or that Jesus was a starving artisan and day laborer, or the embarrassing fact that he comes from Nazareth in Galilee, nothing place of nothing people. Remember how in the 4th Gospel that Nathanael recalls that nothing good comes from Nazareth? Why would Gospel authors invent scandals like those? Answer: they wouldn't. None of it squared with the great hero appearing before them in visions, the Messiah and cosmic Lord, soon to return from Skyvault with power to establish theocracy in the land of Israel. But both insiders and outsiders to the Jesus groups remembered that Jesus was called Jesus of Nazareth. The authors of the Gospels couldn't dodge that embarrassment or the other scandals remembered. They were forced to face these facts, and they did so creatively. But their creative responses were not the stuff of bullshit artists or used car salespeople. They were honestly grappling with how the risen Lord they experienced as risen could possibly have come from such shameful lowly origins. So they wrote truth from truth, folks. Factual truths, remember, are only one type of truth. Truth is a much wider circle, encompassing factual truths. So, Jesus' mother being shamefully pregnant before living with her husband? Paul never talks about this. After Paul, the earliest gospel, Mark, completely omits any infancy stories. If he knew what Matthew and Luke describe about the wondrous birth of Jesus, how could Mark possibly have left that out? But like later evangelists, the anonymous scribe we call Mark nevertheless heard the slander of the gossip network. Some people consider Jesus to be a bastard. Note the culturally unusual expression son of Mary in Mark chapter 6 verse 3. That isn't how you identify somebody in the biblical world. It's the son of the father, not the son of the mother. Unless you don't know who the father is. You're not sure who the father is. Then you might say son of Mary. See? Mark, writing around 70 Common Era and no earlier than 65 Common Era, refers to Jesus the tekton, or artisan, but he never mentions any human father. and other than Joseph of Arimathea, names no other character Joseph. According to context group scholar Andries van Aard, from 70 till 135 Common Era, controversies about peasant Jesus illegitimacy raged between the Jesus groups and their fellow Israelites outside the Jesus groups. At this time, we learn about Joseph. Writing in the 80s, Matthew tells of Joseph's righteousness and his Davidic honor. Matthew draws heavily from the Joseph we find in the book of Genesis. Matthew's Joseph, therefore, also has prophetic dreams. He is described as a hero taking a holy marriage with an impure wife. Aided by God, this Joseph saves his family by taking them into Egypt. Now Luke writes after Matthew, and he's oblivious to many of the details Matthew includes, like the Holy Family ever going into Egypt, or King Herod and his plot to murder newborns. Luke doesn't mention any of that. He instead reports Joseph taking his family on a journey to the temple in Jerusalem. No document written before 70 Common Era mentions Joseph. After the 2nd century, literature augments this figure, sometimes into the bizarre. How much of these so-called facts about Joseph correspond with the historical situation of Jesus? Did any human father play a role in the life of the historical Jesus? These are important questions to ask in this year of Joseph. When writing about great Mediterranean heroes, whatever outstanding characteristics he enjoyed as an adult simply must have been there from birth. They would have remained constant throughout his entire life. That is how ancient Mediterraneans perceived, understood, and communicated human maturation. The unknown anonymous evangelists we call Matthew and Luke were no different. Early Jesus groups believed that the hero Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah and cosmic Lord, soon to come from God with power. Since they recognized this tremendous significance in the adult Jesus, they realized that it must also have belonged to the infant Jesus. Consequently, it was evident to the Jesus groups that the birth and childhood of this hero had to be exactly like Matthew and Luke described it. So Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 1 and 2, even though they have major biographical disagreements and contradict each other, are nevertheless both true. They bring out the truth of Jesus. But American Christian heads explode upon learning all this because our society fails to distinguish truth from factual truths. Hence our unfair demand that truth always be packaged as Western people present it. Do you know why we do this? Maybe it is because, starved of mythology and blocking access to panhuman encounters with God in altered states of consciousness experiences, we American Christians are really just a bunch of scratch-off atheists. It's good to clear up some mistakes made about the roots of our Christmas traditions. Some of these are mistakes made by the author we call Luke, but in other matters, Luke did just fine. It is we who make the mistakes in our translations and gospel readings. In the New American Bible Revised Edition translation of Luke chapter 1 verse 26, we read, "In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth." The New Revised Standard Version is almost identical. It also refers to Nazareth as a town. Back in 1611, the King James Version was actually more honest than these two modern translations. And in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth. The Hellenistic word mistranslated as town and city is a variant of polis. The best way to translate polis might be ancient Mediterranean urban center. The author we call Luke is not calling it a town or a village, and certainly not the tiny, insignificant peasant hamlet of maybe 200 people Nazareth historically was. But Luke does this all the time. He turns peasant nothing places into sprawling urban centers, ancient cities. He does the same thing with Bethlehem, calling it also a major urban center, a polis. The actual Bethlehem and Nazareth had maybe one oven each for the whole village and one bath for everybody each. Why would Luke call these tiny villages major urban centers, ancient cities? Perhaps because of a mix of ignorance and embarrassment. Ignorance because it's evident that the elite author we call Luke, writing in perhaps Athens or maybe Corinth, decades after the Jesus movement, was a Hellenized Israelite whose ancestors centuries earlier had left the land of Israel, and he'd never gone back. He's never been there. He's never been to Bethlehem. He's never been to Jerusalem. He's never been to Nazareth. And he gets his geography wrong all the time. Embarrassment because the anonymous author we call Luke is a sophisticated urban elite scribe grappling to understand stories that originated among the poorest of Mediterranean peasants. Luke is also writing for elites, and he's a spinmeister. He must polish Jesus to appear palatable and relevant to his audience, who, like himself, have never been to Palestine or really dwelt in the agrarian surrounds of their own ancient Mediterranean cities. English translators who know from abundant evidence that Nazareth and Bethlehem could never have been ancient urban centers, but were tiny nothing places, very small hamlets, try and soften what Luke clearly meant by calling these places towns. Like, "O little town of Bethlehem." Folks, this is dishonest to the author. Luke clearly and wrongly meant ancient cities. Now let's take a look at the New Revised Standard Version translation of Luke chapter 1 verse 27. To a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph. Engaged? Is that the correct translation? No way. Engaged is inappropriate. It suggests to the 21st century Bible reader our modern Western custom of pre-marriage engagement between a romantically involved, self-selecting couple. This is not what Luke is describing. Engagement is nothing like the ancient custom of betrothal, which is the proper translation. Engagement concerns self-selecting, romantically involved couples. But betrothal describes arranged marriage, which was Joseph's and Mary's situation. Their parents had arranged their marriage. Notice how Mary is called a virgin here? That doesn't mean her sexual status or the condition of her hymen. It means a teenage girl, just after her menarche, a marriageable and childbearing teenager. Physical virginity, of course, was expected also, being the sine qua non for an honorable marriage. A Mediterranean woman without it would have shamed herself and her entire paternal family. Note Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 13 to 21, about the token of physical virginity, which is a blood-stained sheet that could be demanded. See, again, Luke is polishing things up creatively. He's a good spinmeister. Embarrassment drives him. In the first gospel called Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, Jesus was curiously referred to as Son of Mary. That's a highly unusual way of identifying an ancient Middle Eastern man. In the Middle East, both then and now, the custom is to identify someone through their father. Like Jesus, son of Joseph. But what if paternity was in doubt? Well, then you might insultingly call someone son of his mother, like Jesus was called, son of Mary. You know, when we say son of Mary, we've got over 1,000 years of devotional freight. You know, a lot of Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and other Christians, when they hear son of Mary, they're thinking Christmas, they're thinking rosary, they're thinking something so beautiful and warm and good, something from devotions. But I guarantee you that that's not what Mark intends in chapter 6, verse 3. Son of Mary was a way of calling Jesus a bastard. Folks, it is both good and important to be honest with the Gospels and our Christmas traditions. Those Christmas traditions have humble beginnings, far more humble than our devotional manger scenes suggest. The Gospel called Mark has no Christmas stories. No account of the birth and infancy of Jesus. Why? The Gospel called Mark likewise never mentions Joseph, the father of Jesus. Why? Joseph is not mentioned in any document originating before 70 Common Era. Paul doesn't know Joseph. And Joseph is missing in the gospel called Mark. In the New Testament documents originating after 70 Common Era, reference is made to Joseph, to his righteousness, to his Davidic ancestry, to his dream and the angel's conversation with him, to his holy marriage to the socially perceived impure Mary, to his trip into Egypt with his family, and to his trip to the temple with Mary and Jesus. Context group scholar Andries van Aard asks, did later evangelists invent Joseph, drawing from the well-known and highly reverenced ethical example of the Joseph found in the book of Genesis, a great Israelite hero later enhanced by Hellenistic Semitic literature? Could this biblical Joseph have served as the model for the transmitters of the early Jesus tradition? Van Aard argues convincingly it did. Did these third-wave Jesus group writers, like Matthew, invent the New Testament Joseph based on this ancient Israelite hero? The anonymous authors of the Gospels called Matthew, Luke, and John were Hellenized Israelites, all who knew well the Israelite Joseph tradition. They found themselves, like other Jesus group people living from 70 to 135 Common Era, involved in heated controversies with fellow Israelites about Jesus' illegitimacy. Could they have counteracted the position widely held by enemies to the Jesus group that Jesus was a bastard by positioning Jesus to be the son of Joseph, the son of Jacob? Look at how the gospel called Mark begins. No annunciation, no angels, no Joseph, no Bethlehem. Instead, we start off with the adult Jesus being baptized, where he is declared son. Right off the bat in the gospel called Mark, Jesus is declared legitimate by God. Who's going to refute that? Why no Christmas stories in Mark? Simple. They hadn't been invented yet. Whether Joseph historically existed or not, the historical Jesus probably grew up without a father playing a significant role in his life. His fellow peasants imagined Jesus to be a bastard. No one in the Galilee would hail Mary as a holy woman. Van Aard argues that Jesus was baptized and joined John the Baptist's political religious movement probably to deal with some perceived sinful sickness Jesus had, namely his lowly social status, his condition as bastard, and that needed to be addressed and healed. The closest thing to Christmas stories we get in Mark is Jesus' baptism. Why would the historical Jesus want to be dunked by John the prophet, who, by the way, wasn't historically related to Jesus? Luke makes that detail up later. Whether or not there was a historical Joseph, if the historical Jesus was perceived to be a fatherless child, this unfortunate relationship with his family might provide us with probable clues. Moreover, Jesus' troubling and shameful origins may provide insight about his relationship with his family and his fellow peasant villagers in Nazareth. What could it reveal about his vision of God as Father or Mediterranean patron? or his vision notably of children and of other so-called nothing people from his society. Given this backdrop, an altogether different portrait of Jesus' initial activity emerges. Imagine the peasant Jesus suffering the sin of being a bastard. Remember that sin in the Bible is not the later theologically evolved understanding of sin many Christians have today. Sin in the Bible is the act that shames or dishonors God. To be a bastard and be an Israelite is to be the living embodiment of sin, of shame, of dishonor to God. He moves away from his home village, trapped in a strained relationship with relatives who are burdened by his existence as shameful bastard and embarrassment. There, in alternate reality, Jesus experiences healing and commissioning in a homecoming into God's kingdom. Through his altered state of consciousness experienced at his baptism, Jesus probably encountered the reality created by the Spirit of God, which developed his perception of the care of a sky vault patron who accepted him as beloved. And the historical Jesus, now commissioned shamanic healer, both attested to and lived out this reality. Through the stories of associates and later writings of their followers, Jesus became the icon of God's forgiveness of sin and providential care. The circumstances of Jesus' conception and birth, described by the anonymous Third Wave Jesus Group author we call Matthew, take on sharper contours when viewed in their Mediterranean cultural context. Matthew chapter 1 verses 18 to 24. The origins of Jesus, Messiah, are thus. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through a Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since he was a tzaddik, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her leniently. Such was his intention when, look, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home, for it is through a holy wind that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. Look, the woman of childbearing and marriageable age shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took his wife into his home. Let's talk a bit about biblical betrothal and marriage. It would be wrong to consider betrothal as similar to our Western idea of engagement before marriage. Engagement happens between two romantic, self-selecting partners. Betrothal was the initial phase of the biblical marriage process, something radically different than the marriage we know about even in our religious traditions. In the biblical marriage process, prospective spouses, commonly patrilateral first cousins, were set apart for each other. That is betrothal. Though a betrothed couple did not live together, a formal divorce was required to break the public establishment of the betrothal. Sex with a betrothed woman was considered adultery, an act committed by a man to shame or dishonor another man. Biblical marriage, like that between Joseph and Mary, means ancient Mediterranean marriage. In the ancient Mediterranean world, marriages were arranged by mothers and fathers to join extended families and not individuals. The biblical or Mediterranean bride did not expect love. She did not expect companionship. And she did not expect comfort. In this rigidly gender-divided world, men and women had very little contact. Indeed, the weakest emotional bond from this cultural world was that between spouses, because of the arranged nature of their union. Both partners realized that their union was arranged for the political or economic advantage of their families. The entire biblical, i.e. Mediterranean marriage process was a ritualized removal of a woman from her family. The groom's father, normally the brother of the bride's father, offered gifts or services to the bride's father to win the wife he wanted for his son. The bride's father made the final decision. The women of both families, the intelligentsia of the ancient Mediterranean and Middle Eastern village, negotiate the contract to make certain neither family gets shortchanged. But the patriarch of each family ratified the contract publicly. When the groom took the bride into his home, really the house compound of his father in this patrilocal arrangement, the marriage process was completed. Now, in light of all of this, let's discuss Mary's pregnancy. Consider, given the very nosy nature of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern village life, where everybody's business is minding everybody else's business, and there is zero privacy, and given the separation of men from women in this extremely gender-divided cultural world, and given the fact that the betrothed couple were not yet living together, Joseph, as presented in the story, may have been among the last to learn about Mary's pregnancy. The village women, again the intelligentsia of Bethlehem, would have noticed that Mary was not participating in their obligatory monthly ritual purification. Villages like Bethlehem and Nazareth only had one bath. The anonymous author we call Matthew inserts an explanation for his readers. Mary is pregnant by a spirit, a wind, an other than human person that is holy. This is a good spirit who did this. Not a mischievous spirit, not an evil spirit, but a holy spirit. That's all well and good for the readers, but what about Joseph? Well, Joseph will have to learn this in another way. Think about Joseph's predicament. The honor code of the Mediterranean world demands that no one take what properly belongs to another. Mary's child does not belong to Joseph. It's not his. So he hesitates to take it. He also knows that he will be unable to display publicly the tokens of virginity on his wedding night. My friends, if Joseph doesn't act quickly, he will be dishonored. He will be publicly shamed as a cuckold. By law, Joseph is entitled to return Mary to her father and expose her to death. Numbers chapter 5 describes the ordeal Mary would have to undergo. But Joseph is an honorable man and determines to divorce her leniently. There is no such thing as a quiet divorce in this cultural world. Joseph's sense of honor hopes that the rightful father will seize this opportunity to claim the child and marry Mary. In all of his decision-making, Joseph acts very honorably. And Joseph learns the will of the God of Israel. Our Mediterranean ancestors in the faith generally tried to live by the will of God. But how did God make God's will known? And how did people learn it? Elites, such as Herod, resorted to the very expensive option of consulting scripture experts. But ordinary folk, peasants like Joseph, had to rely on ordinary means. The prophet Joel reports a proverb that captures a basic Mediterranean belief. Old men dream dreams, young men see visions. Joseph dreamed dreams. So too did the astrologers. Both Joseph and the astrologers learn God's will in a dream. This is not only the ordinary way of learning God's will, but also an allusion to their age. They must be old men, because old men dream dreams. But remember, because of widespread terrible health and hygiene conditions, less than 5% of the population lived to the age of 30. God personally announces to Joseph the gender of the child. A highly prized male is a special gift of God in this culture, and God also personally assigns the child's name, Jesus. This fact immediately immerses Jesus in honor far surpassing human calculation, and further enhances Joseph's honorable reputation, for God would never honor a shameful person. In an effort to contemporize the biblical record, some modern preachers and creatives online communicating through social media like memes speak about Mary as a pregnant, unwed teenage girl and describe Jesus' family as homeless. spiritually, we can and should find Christ today, especially in those of our human family so marginalized and trounced upon by systematic injustice. And we must fight against the horror of injustice afflicting them. Having said that, these clever descriptions are ill-suited to Mediterranean culture and are unfair to Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. While the circumstances and embarrassment of Mary's predicament look similar to American experiences, the consequences in her culture were radically different. This is how our New American Bible Revised Edition puts it. Now, this is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through the capital H Holy, capital S Spirit. Now, in reality, the text should be like this. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. This is the origin of Jesus Messiah. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they lived together, she was found with child through a lowercase h, holy, lowercase s, spirit. This is an addition from the author, this little parenthetical bracketed comment, to tell his audience, hang tough, Mediterraneans. This story is going to turn out okay. Don't panic. That's why he's got to put that bracketed comment in there. Most translations have something like the, capital H Holy, capital H Spirit. The problem is that the is not in the Greek manuscripts we have of Matthew. There's no article, ho. So if there's no the, what does that do to Holy Spirit? It's not the Holy Spirit. Capital H Holy and capital S Spirit become lowercase h Holy and lowercase s Spirit, as in a Holy Spirit, a holy wind. The author is living centuries before the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD. He's not talking about the third person of the Trinity. He's talking about a Holy Spirit, a holy wind, spirit, which anthropologists call an other-than-human person. Try to understand this, folks. The world of the Middle East is very different than ours. In the world of the Middle East, there is believed by their cultural consensual reality that the air all around us is densely populated with other-than-human persons we call spirits. There are good spirits, and there are bad spirits, and there are just plain mischievous spirits who enjoy nothing better than screwing around with us. We see that in like Job chapter 1. Job, right, is on earth, and God is up on the sky vault with all his sons, and up comes the Satan. That's one of those spirits. God says to them, hey, look at my servant Job. He's a real man. He's honorable. He's loyal to me. Yeah, says the Satan, God's prosecuting attorney, God's secret agent in the sky. Yeah, that's only because you love him so much. You're so attached to him. You're so stuck on him and bless him. It's easy for somebody to be loyal. If you give him all that you give him, all right, go screw with him. But you'll see he's a real man. And that's Job chapter 1. So he goes around and screws with him. So the author of Matthew is telling his audience, it's a good, look, it's not a mischievous spirit, and it's not a wicked spirit that did this. It's trying to destroy Mary. It's a good spirit that did this. Don't worry. Don't worry. Chill out. It's going to be okay.
Saint Joseph is highly misunderstood by many Catholics and other Christians. How can we see Joseph better? Meaning, in an historically and culturally plausible way. I challenge you to take the following quiz on Joseph. It will help you better understand him, Jesus, and the Gospels. 1. Before Joseph lived with Mary, what was their probable relationship? A. Childhood sweethearts. B. Best friends. C. Both A and B. D. Patrilateral first cousins. 2. When did Joseph and Mary get engaged? A. Following a great amount of prayer. B. After Mary had spent much time in the temple. C. They never were engaged. D. After they fell in love. 3. Which of the following best describes the union of Mary and Joseph? A. A religious union called marriage. B. A civil union called marriage. C. A covenant by which a man and woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. D. The union or the pooling of honor of two Middle Eastern families whereby the two spouses represent the kinship groups. 4. In biblical marriage, God's will means A. That the spouses, a man and a woman, freely choose not under constraint. B. That the consent between the spouses is an indispensable element that makes the marriage. C. Both A and B. D. That the fathers and mothers of bride and groom do the choosing. 5. When, according to the Matthean infancy narrative, Joseph discovers that Mary is pregnant, initially he is A. Overwhelmed and feels unworthy to play a role with the Holy Mother and Holy Child. B. Humiliated as a cuckold, probably the last person in the village to find out about Mary's pregnancy. C. Grateful to the God of Israel. D. None of the above. 6. Who were the first villagers to discover Mary's pregnancy? A. The women, who are the intelligentsia of the Middle Eastern village. B. Joseph, when the angel of the Lord told him. C. Mary's best friend, Joanna. D. Mary's dad, Joachim. 7. How did people find out that Mary was pregnant before living with Joseph? A. The angel of the Lord told them. B. They just knew it had to be a miracle. C. Either when Mary didn't show up at the only village bath at the time each month when the women gathered to cleanse, or when she did show up, tried to hide it but couldn't. D. When Mary went around the village with a tambourine, singing praises to God because she was pregnant. 8. Matthew informs his readers that Joseph was a righteous man. This means that he A. was a morally upstanding person. B. was an Israelite holy man, what anthropologists would call a shaman, someone who can talk with spirits in alternate reality. C. hardly ever did anything to be guilty about. D. someone who prayed a lot. 9. Righteous men like Joseph always want to please God. In Matthew, when Joseph learns of Mary's pregnancy, he does not want to accept the child because A. Joseph knows that the child cannot be his, and to accept the child would therefore make Joseph a thief, something that would displease God. B. He feels radically unworthy before the Holy Mother and Holy Child. C. He feels confused and betrayed. D. None of the above. 10. Because in Matthew, Joseph knows that Mary is pregnant already, that means A. God must have done this. B. The devil must have done this. C. Some other human male must have done this. D. There is no way to consummate the marriage, and therefore no way to show the blood-stained sheet to the village at the wedding feast. This will lead to shame and death. 11. How do Mediterranean people like Joseph solve seemingly impossible dilemmas and crises? A. Just like Americans do, with intelligence and hard work. B. Getting advice from family members and friends. C. Through an alternate state of consciousness experience. D. By talking with a priest. 12. When Joseph took Mary into his house, that means that A. They lied to everyone at the wedding celebration by faking the blood-stained sheet. B. They told everyone that it's okay that Mary was pregnant early because it was God's will. C. They eloped, skipped town, and hid out in a nearby village until things blew over. D. They paid off everyone to keep their mouths shut. 13. How do you imagine Joseph acting as father to Jesus? A. Joseph was a warm and kind-hearted daddy. B. A hard-working but quiet provider for Mary and Jesus. C. Both A and B. D. Like a Middle Eastern North African father, someone mostly absent from a boy's early life. 14. Thinking about Joseph and Mary, what is the strongest emotional bond among Middle Eastern personalities? A. Between mother and firstborn son. B. Between husband and wife. C. Between brothers. D. Between masters and slaves. 15. And what is the weakest emotional bond among Middle Eastern personalities? A. Between mother and firstborn son. B. Between husband and wife. C. Between brothers. D. Between masters and slaves. 16. How do you think Mary would have fared in Joseph's father's home, the patriarchal compound? A. Always suspect and never truly fitting in. B. Loved and cherished as one of the family. C. Reverenced as the Holy Mother of God. D. They didn't live with Joseph's father. The Holy Family was a nuclear family, just like Americans imagine. 17. In the biblical or Mediterranean world, all women in the patriarchal compound do what to their prepubescent sons? A. Teach them to read the Bible and pray. B. Let them play wherever they want. C. Treat them equally with the village girls. D. Spoil them rotten, doting on them and keeping them pampered, pleasured, embraced, and drowned in warmth. 18. Because of their fiercely gender-divided world, with father and all male role models absent, when men of prepubescent males like Jesus grow up, they necessarily are haunted their entire lives by A. A longing for their fathers. B. A sense of deep compassion given them by their mothers and sisters. C. Gender ambiguity. D. A deeper commitment to religion. 19. Because they are forever haunted by the correct answer to the last question, Middle Eastern North African males compensate for this by means of A. Constantly proving their manhood through Middle Eastern North African hyper-ethnomasculinity. B. Trusting in God. C. Listening to the advice mother gives. D. None of the above. 20. Depending on how long he lived past Jesus' puberty, how would Joseph have probably raised the teenage Jesus? A. With deep prayer and teaching him to be a carpenter by trade. B. Like any great daddy would. C. Both A and B. D. By severe physical beatings, conditioning Jesus to withstand any punishment without complaining. 21. Say as an American Christian, I treat the Bible like a manual on how to raise sons or daughters in our American setting. I follow it closely and act out its prescriptions. What probably will be the result? A. Psychopathology and prison time. B. Holy children who fear the Lord. C. The salvation of America. D. Both B and C. 22. What was Joseph's profession? A. Carpenter. B. Teacher. C. Peasant village artisan. D. None of the above. 23. Given Joseph's work, he and his family were A. Middle class. B. Wealthy. C. Poor. D. Extremely poor. 24. Joseph had to travel to find work. This meant he was viewed by others as A. A righteous man who works hard for his family. B. A social deviant. C. Someone famous throughout Galilee. D. Someone with connections. Well, that's it. How do you think you did? To find out, look below in the description for a link to a Patheos blog to find the right answers and gauge how well you know Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as they are presented in the Gospels. Enjoy! Since all people are born more or less equal, ancient biographers like Plutarch regularly created special origins and extraordinary circumstances for the great people whose lives they narrated. The anonymous author, traditionally remembered as Matthew, was, in this regard, a lot like Plutarch, although it is a tremendously complicated issue. Biblical scholars agree that the evangelist similarly embellished and almost certainly created stories about the birth of Jesus, the Galilean folk healer and nothing person who was put to death presumably for claiming to be king of the Judeans. The story of the Magi, found nowhere else in the New Testament, illustrates the plausible mixture of fact with literary creativity. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, look, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is this newborn king of the Judeans? We saw his star at its rising, and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may go and do him homage." After their audience with the king, they set out, and look, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them, until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their country by another way. Let's consider the Magi in the East. The Greek word magoi in this story has been translated in modern times as wise men, but that's too generic. Kings, simply incorrect. And astrologers, much closer than wise men or kings, but still only partially correct. Astrologers is only partly correct because ancient astrologers were not like the modern Western people who call themselves by that name. So, calling the Magi or Magoi astrologers becomes confusing because of modern connotations. The New American Bible Revised Edition rightly renders the word Magoi into Magi. In the cultural world of Jesus, Magi were a caste of very high-ranking political religious advisors to the rulers of the Median and then the Persian empires, roughly equivalent to the modern countries of Iran and Iraq. The ancient writers Strabo and Xenophon point out that in Persia, Magi communicated with the high god Ahura Mazda on behalf of the great king, or as they called him, the King of Kings. The fact that at one point Magi successfully revolted against and replaced the Persian king indicates that they were also an ever-present internal threat for Persia. History notes that Magi also resisted the imperialistic designs of Philip the Macedonian and Alexander the Great to conquer the ancient Near Eastern people. Hellenistic peoples viewed the Persians as decadent and weak. The Persians obviously resented that. Indeed, Persian prophecies, similar to Daniel's vision of the four kingdoms, each more decadent than the preceding Babylonian, Median, Persian, and Hellenistic, yearned for a restoration of true Persian kingship. When the Romans began to dominate the world scene, the Magi increased their support for Eastern Persian kingship and encouraged resistance against Western Roman imperialism. in the year 66 Common Era, while putting down the Judean revolt in Jerusalem, the Romans agreed to accept the Parthian candidate Tiridates as legitimate king of Armenia, rather than appoint a puppet king like Herod and his sons in Israel. Tiridates took the sons of 3 neighboring Parthian rulers and an entourage including Magi, relatives, servants, 3,000 horsemen, and numerous Romans, and made an all-expenses-paid-by-the-Romans 9-month pilgrimage to bend the knee to and accept the crown from Emperor Nero at Rome. Well, you can imagine that historical event was burned into the memories of everyone in the first-century Mediterranean world. Clearly, the Magi had enormous influence as advisors to Eastern kings. The anonymous author we call Matthew, writing sometime over 2 decades following this lavish pilgrimage, was undoubtedly familiar with the story, like he did when he repurposed and spun out a new take on an old Moses story with his account of the slaughter of the innocents. And the flight into Egypt. Matthew again repurposed and retold a famous story, the one about the pilgrimage from the east with the Magi. But instead of Nero or Tiridates being king of kings, that role went to peasant infant Jesus. So let's consider Matthew's Magi. In the hypothetically recreated original story of the Magi and Jesus, the Magi chart Jesus' horoscope, discover and follow his star, a comet really, find and worship him, and leave. How did Matthew reshape this historical event to fit into the birth story of Jesus? Drawing inspiration from the Tiridates story, Matthew puts a very appropriate political spin on Jesus' story. Known for their centuries-old opposition to Western, currently Roman, imperialism, the Eastern Magi travel to submit to Jesus, a new Eastern king of the Judeans. The Magi proclaim a message that resounds beyond the confines of Israel to the entire ancient Near East. Here, in this peasant baby, is the new King of Kings. Here begins the restoration of true Eastern kingship. Man, that Roman boot-licking, murderous, and tyrannical puppet king, Herod the Great, had every reason to squirm and pee his pants. To add insult to Herod's injury, the Gospel story interprets the visit of the Magi as saying that liberation from foreign domination and restored Eastern kingship has come not from the elite, but rather from the poor and humble in a peasant hamlet, Bethlehem, of a rather insignificant principality, Judea. Later evolved Christian tradition and liturgy have overlaid the Matthean visit of the Magi, Jesus' Epiphany, with engaging symbolism and rich interpretations. We do well to remember that at the heart of this story, as in all the stories of the Bible, lies plain history, real politics, and human effort viewed through an ever-changing assortment of lenses. Throughout his gospel, the anonymous author we call Matthew presents Jesus as another Moses. This emphasis begins already early on in Matthew chapter 2, from which the gospel reading for the feast of the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph is drawn. Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 15, verses 19 to 23. When the Magi had departed, look, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, that what the Lord had said through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. Skipping ahead to verse 19. When Herod had died, look, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, Rise, "Take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." He rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go back there. And because he had been warned in a dream, he departed for the region of Galilee. He went and dwelt in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene.
Only Matthew tells of the slaughter of the innocents and the flight to Egypt. You remember that one? Herod's going to kill all the boy babies, so they flee down to Egypt. Does that story sound familiar? But do you remember it told about anybody else? It's told about Moses, right? Does anybody happen to know that it's also told about Sargon the Great? 2,000 years before Moses? It begins to look like that's a stock story in the repertoire of stories of the ancient Near East, and one can haul it out and apply it to anybody if you wish to make a point. Well, Matthew is the only writer in the New Testament who tells us that story. No other early Christian writer mentions it. So you begin to ask, how does it fit Matthew's agenda? Well, it turns out it does. Matthew's trying to present Jesus as the new Moses. So we got to get a Moses story in here. All right? Did that actually happen? No. Theologically, is it true? Yes. Jesus was, for Matthew and his community, the new and greater Moses. And the use of that old story says so.
In the first century, it was popular to retell and embellish the Moses story rather freely. Just look at the version of this story found in Josephus and Pseudo-Philo. Here we have two excellent examples of this kind of rewritten Bible, which has parallels in Matthew chapter 2 and helps us understand what the infancy narrative of Matthew is and isn't. Folks, it isn't fact-precise biographical history. The unknown anonymous evangelist we call Matthew desires his readers to see a continuity between Moses and Jesus. So, he invents a story, an imaginative retelling of an old Middle Eastern stock story that was told even before the days of the historical Moses, used and reused whenever needs arose.
We have many isolated sayings, anecdotes, and events, some of which are undoubtedly historical, some of which are not. The Gospels are interpretive and theological accounts, not history books. The fact is, the Jesus of no two Gospels is alike. They simply are not. Jesus is the new Moses to Matthew. That's not even on Luke's radar screen. Historical data is minimal, and it's very rarely on the surface. Some of the stories are undoubtedly historical. Others are borrowed, created, embellished, theologized. The problem is to tell which is which. That's the problem. So the bottom line, one cannot simply read the Gospels and expect to uncover an account of the historical Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but when I grew up, everybody that I knew as a young person just assumed you could, everybody assumed that you read the Gospels and that told you what happened. And part of the reason for that is that since the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, we have come to be so literalistic in our way of thinking that we tend to only trust what is historical. We tend to say, well, it isn't true if it didn't happen. But many things are true that didn't happen. It really is true that Jesus was a new Moses. Even if he never went down to Egypt as the story says. We are so literalistic in our mentality that we just make the automatic assumption that these guys were writing history books about Jesus. They're not.
Now let's consider King Herod. Because of a miscalculation in the 6th century by the monk Dionysius Exiguus, otherwise known as Denny the Dwarf, who arranged the calendar we follow to this day, giving us the Anno Domini, or AD, time reckoning, Jesus was actually born about 6 BCE, 6 years before the Common Era, and King Herod died about 4 years before the Common Era. Herod was a ruthless king who didn't hesitate to murder family members to preserve his position. The Feast of the Holy Innocents remembers details in the Matthean story that don't exactly correspond to reality. We've never found mass gravesite of infants. That probably never happened, but for sure, Herod was a murderer of his own children. In this invented retelling of Moses-like Matthean Jesus and his origins, Joseph learns of Herod's intrigue and God's will to save the child Jesus in a dream, instructing him to flee with his family to Egypt. Egypt was a traditional place of refuge for Israelites. It came under Roman rule in 30 BCE and was beyond Herod's jurisdiction. Now let's consider Herod's 3 sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. King Herod sent his sons as young men to Rome so that they might learn how to be rulers. When Herod died, Archelaus inherited Judea proper, the area including and surrounding Jerusalem. He also inherited Samaria and Idumea. Archelaus was every bit as cruel a ruler as his father. Herod Antipas received Galilee and Perea. This is the Herod who beheaded John the Dipper, and whom Jesus called that fox. Galilee was much more peaceful and a little more secure than Judea, and that might explain why, at least in the Matthean story, the Judean Joseph elected to settle his family in Galilee instead of in Bethlehem. Keep in mind that, according to Matthew, the Holy Family are natives from Bethlehem in Judea, and they have never been to Nazareth in Galilee before. That's right, the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke offer contradictory details, which cannot be harmonized. These stories were never meant to be harmonized into a hodgepodge narrative. But try telling that to sentimental Christian folks, arranging Christmas pageants and manger scenes. When it comes down to sentimentality and truth, the latter often loses badly, at least in the short term. Now let's consider Nazareth of Galilee, nothing place of nothing people. The anonymous author we call Matthew was from a polis, an ancient Mediterranean urban center. 1 of 2% of the total population who can read and write. The man we name Matthew was trained to spin things when writing about a great Mediterranean hero, like Jesus the Messiah. So, he calls Nazareth a polis, but it wasn't. In reality, Nazareth was a hamlet, numbering about maybe 100 starving peasants. There were a few families there at most, very likely all related to each other. In such a tiny village, first cousin marriage partners would be easy to find. This hamlet was not far from the sea highway, the principal trade route to and from Egypt. Another major road from Acco toward Tiberias crossed the sea highway near Nazareth. Located so close to a major crossroads, Nazareth understandably gravitated toward the big polis of Sepphoris at that crossroads. Mentioned nowhere in the Bible, Sepphoris was very important. In Jesus' day, it was the district capital where Herod Antipas carried out massive building programs, providing work for artisans in the region. Around the year 200 Common Era, Rabbi Judah the Prince spent the last years of his life there codifying the Mishnah. Galilee thus was the place where both what would become Christianity and post-biblical Talmudic Judaism got conceived. Now let's consider the Holy Family. Modern Americans who imagine Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as a nuclear family inappropriately transform them into Americans. The Middle Eastern family is enormous and quite extended. However the historical situation of Jesus' origins were, it is possible that the Holy Family did have relatives in the village of Bethlehem. But it is extremely probable that all the inhabitants of Nazareth were members of Jesus' extended family. Middle Eastern families relate differently than Western families. The strongest emotional bond in that cultural world is between mother and oldest son. It remains this way throughout their lives. The weakest emotional bond is between husband and wife. Though we know precious little about this family's life in Nazareth after returning from Egypt, Matthew portrays Jesus as someone quite capable of functioning effectively in the public world of the Mediterranean male. In that regard anyway, his large extended village family raised him well. Finally, note Matthew's combination of place names with scripture quotations. With his account of the flight into Egypt, the anonymous author relates this to Hosea chapter 11 verse 1. And with his account of the return to Nazareth, Matthew claims that he has a basis for this in scripture. He shall be called a Nazarene. But that verse remains unidentified. This suggests that, according to the author we call Matthew, Jesus' family directed him toward his destiny according to the scriptures. That is, in harmony with God's will, as disclosed in the Bible. Can that be true for contemporary Christian families also?
Many confuse two important beliefs for Christians: the virgin birth and the Immaculate Conception. Why? Because while much good has come from Christianity, historically speaking, one of the very ugly things has been its distorting human sex and sexuality into something dirty. Don't blame Jesus or Paul for that. Neither were responsible. Instead, second century followers of Paul recontextualize Paul, and they are to blame. So too are Christians who followed them and failed to correct this. Today, when we hear immaculate, we think clean, and so this connection lends to confusion. Mary is absolutely clean, and it therefore makes sense that she never got dirty from sex. So the popular misunderstanding is to confuse the Immaculate Conception of Mary with the virginal conception and birth of Jesus. And the history is even more confusing. Virgin is a word that has evolved over the centuries, mixed up as it is with Mary as an evolving symbol herself. When post-apostolic Jesus group people called Mary virgin in the 2nd century, were they necessarily talking about her sexual status or the condition of her physical organs and hymen? Originally, virgin meant a female of marriageable age, which in the ancient circum-Mediterranean world of the Bible was just after her menarche. But the meaning of virgin and virginity evolved. As it changed, the physical virgin birth became an essential Christian belief for many. But that didn't happen really before the 5th century.
The notion of virgin birth as a theological or as a biological miracle, all right, has become a theological cornerstone of faith for, probably the majority of Christians in our era. Not so in antiquity. That really didn't become even an important factor until Augustine. Augustine cooked up the notion that original sin was passed along biologically. All right? Well, we can't have a sinful Jesus, so we got to have him born without that bad gene. Well, in antiquity, people knew the existence of the sperm. They did not know the existence of the egg. So if we don't have a father passing along the bad sperm that would have made him guilty of original sin, we can get a pure Jesus. That began to make the biological virgin birth ever more important theologically. It was to protect the sinlessness of Jesus. Well, in the 18th century, when they discovered the existence of the egg, now we got a problem.
Ancient people did not understand sexual reproduction. Ancient Mediterranean fathers were called potent or impotent, like seed, while Mediterranean mothers were fertile or barren, like fields. We still haven't kicked the habit of this antiquated language, folks. To ancients, fathers alone generate offspring. The whole essence of a newly born boy or girl, to the ancient mindset, derived entirely from the father. Hence, fathers alone beget. And we see this language in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 16, the Matthean genealogy for Jesus. The mother serves merely as a passive nurturing agent who conceives and bears children. The way ancients saw it, children are begotten of mothers, or begotten in mothers, but not begotten by mothers. The man does all the work. All the woman has to do is hold on to the seed, thought the ancients. She can't even do that right. Look at all those miscarriages. That's how people thought for a long time, folks. The woman was seen entirely as a passive player in sexual reproduction. That's how Augustine thought. Since the male is the only one who contributes genetically to the offspring by his tainted sinful seed, Augustine saw that it was essential that sinless Jesus could not have had a human father. He eisegetically read his new understanding into the New Testament library, only recently assembled and canonized. Since the mother gives nothing to the child except nurturing, she cannot pass along any biological original sin contaminated in her blood. So, the church didn't need Jesus to have a sinless mother yet. But over 1,000 years later, in the 18th century, the human egg was discovered. It turns out that half of everything comes from the mother. Now, to maintain a biologically sinless Jesus, you also need a sinless mother. Now, the belief in the Immaculate Conception had evolved over a long period of time, but declaring this belief a dogma came by way of a microscope. Therefore, Pope Pius IX declared this dogma December 8, 1854.
So now we got to have a perfectly clean Mary in order to get a clean Jesus. So the question becomes, if Augustine was the one who sort of made it this whole biology question important, what about before that? One of the things you quickly discover was that virgin birth was a common story in antiquity. Julius Caesar was born of a virgin. Augustus Caesar was born of a virgin. Alexander the Great was born of a virgin. Why? One of the things that ancient people did was when a lowlife gave birth to a son, they expected that son to be a lowlife. When a great person had a son, he was supposed to be a great person. What did not compute with them was when a lowlife turned out to have a son who's a great person. That didn't make no sense. And so they argued that it could only happen if God was in some unique way, or the gods were in some unique way involved. That can produce greatness from bad genetic stock. All right. So that was one factor for the ancients. The other is, they used the term virgin. It didn't have anything to do with biology. It was an honor title. They could talk about a virgin mother. And what they meant was that if a woman is truly honorable, you give her the most honorable title our society has for a woman. And she has that title her whole life. So what would have surprised early Christians is not that they called Mary a virgin, but that they called Mary a virgin. She's a peasant girl. That's not the kind of people who got that title. So for the earliest Christians, it was an honor title, not a biological title. And it only became biological after Augustine. And we have the hokey, Immaculate Conception thing when we discover the egg. And somehow it has taken on meanings it never had. And I should point out to you that not only are Matthew and Luke the only writers in the New Testament who mention it, nobody else does either for several hundred years. So you got to put these things in a little historical context.
Consider the Visitation story in the gospel we call Luke. Over the centuries, brilliant artists have interpreted it on canvas and stone. But how do 21st century American readers hear and interpret this story? It would be somewhat humorous were a contemporary United States reader to imagine Mary getting into her pickup truck, traveling over the interstate, and doing lunch with Elizabeth. Jokes aside, what should we imagine when reading this ancient story? Surely it should be that scenario that Mediterranean culture suggests. For the first reading of all Scripture and the Gospels is Mediterranean culture. In this ancient Mediterranean story, Mary seems to travel on a 4-day journey alone. Folks, women in the ancient Middle East and circum-Mediterranean world could never do anything alone. Either they were constantly inside a cluster of women and children, or always under the watchful eye of some significant related male family member, their father, brother, or husband. Consider Mary, no older than 14 years, betrothed but not yet living with her husband, going about the Middle East alone, unchaperoned, unaccompanied, unencompassed. How vulnerable would she be to charges of shameful intentions and conduct? And she is pregnant, and there she goes on her solo journey. Even if a village male were to do this kind of traveling alone, that would earn him being labeled a social deviant. Can you imagine what a pregnant teenage girl in this ancient culture doing this would be called? Would anyone from this cultural world witnessing her do this have any doubt in their mind about her pregnancy afterward? To them, it would be obvious how she got pregnant. And I'm not talking angels and God, folks. Americans belonging to the only culture seemingly crippled from distinguishing truth from facts are obsessed with facticity and historicity. Did this visitation story really happen? Whatever the case, in the story at least, perhaps Mary joined a caravan. Even for ancient men, solitary travel was not safe. But Luke doesn't mention that Mary joined a caravan. Is there a plausible cultural explanation for Mary having a solo journey? Maybe. 21st century Western people have sophisticated knowledge unknown to ancients like Luke and his audience. It becomes extremely difficult for us to suspend this scientific knowledge in order to understand simpler human explanations for pregnancy found in ancient scripture. We forget that only 200 years ago, we didn't know about the facts of reproduction and childbearing. So, biblical authors and characters held a much simpler view of life than we do. The ancients believed that the male deposited an homunculus, that is, a miniature, fully formed human being, into the female. The male provided a seed, the woman was the field. According to this worldview, conception difficulties are entirely the fault of the field and not the seed. Ever since human beings have been around, pregnant women have experienced movement of the child in the womb. Recall the mythic story of Genesis chapter 25. Rebekah felt movement and perhaps even suspected that she was bearing twins. That movement got interpreted as a struggle between the children, symbolizing the eventual struggle of two nations, both children represented. In the Visitation story, Elizabeth interprets the movement of her child in her womb as a leap prompted by joy at hearing Mary's greeting. When Elizabeth informs her kinswoman about this, Mary may well have been confirmed in another growing conviction about her own fetus. Just as the angel announced, her yet unborn child is holy. What did the author we call Luke mean by holy? The words holy and holiness bear at least 2,000 years of theological freight. So let's peel that later evolved and accrued meaning back so as to honestly understand what Luke meant in his context. Doing that, we discover that holiness for Luke is a quality that wards off or protects against evil and demons. In modern technical jargon, the unborn child's holiness is an apotropaic power, that is, a force stronger than evil and evil spirits. In this story, Mary could easily conclude that it is safe for her to travel alone because she would be protected by her child's special power, just as Tobit was protected by the disguised angel Raphael on his journey abroad. Unwise was the ancient traveler who made their way through the wilds and roads out far from home. For in dark corners greedy eyes glitter, claws curl, teeth click. But bearing a holy fetus with apotropaic powers, what was there to fear? Contemporary cultural descendants of our ancestors in the faith in the Middle East rely heavily on talismans and similar charms, often blue in color, to protect them from evil and evil spirits. Later Mediterranean believers associated Mary with the color blue. Interesting, no? In 1964, the Pontifical Biblical Commission noted that the evangelists selected certain things out of the many which had been handed on. Some they synthesized, and some they explained with an eye to the situation of the churches. So this passage in Luke is considered something he developed as a literary artist, inventing creatively and writing theologically. He's not a journalist, folks. He's not a historian. That's not what Luke Acts is. And so the Visitation story does not come from the memoirs of Mary, the historical peasant girl. Think about this. Wouldn't Mary have been a very unfeeling kinswoman to carelessly leave Elizabeth, as she does in verse 56, at the moment of Elizabeth's greatest need, childbirth? Luke is surely aware of the cultural inconsistencies and improbabilities of his Visitation story. So too were his ancient original readers. But unlike us 21st century Western Bible readers, Luke's original audience easily recognized Luke's intention. The author we call Luke wanted to explain a dimension of the origins of John the Baptizer and Jesus for his readers. No, historically speaking, John and Jesus were not biologically related. They weren't cousins, they weren't kin. Luke made that up. But he brings together the two mothers-to-be to show how both recognize and praise the God of Israel, who is actively involved in their mundane, humdrum lives. That's a profound truth, folks, even if the story details are not factual. We Americans and other Western peoples are notorious for our weak knowledge of history, especially if anything had happened prior to our date of birth. So it is strange indeed when American believers try to pursue the literal facticity of biblical stories such as this, which originally served an entirely different purpose. This story wasn't written to give people facts about what happened. We can only admire the magnificent talent and inspiration of Luke the evangelist, Luke the spinmeister, who has made his theological point emphatically, if imaginatively graphic. God does indeed work in strange and mysterious ways, and inspiration must be a messy business. The infancy narratives of Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 1 and 2 provide us with the origin of Christmas. But our Christmas observances are 2,000 years evolved. Sometimes these distort what the texts of Matthew and Luke are actually saying. Take, for example, what the author we call Luke tells us about the inn and the manger. Peasant houses in first century Israel normally had only one room, though sometimes a guest room would have been attached. The family usually occupied one end of the main room, often raised, and the animals the other. The manger was located in between. The manger would have been the normal place for peasant births, with the women of the house assisting. So Jesus the peasant being born in a manger really wasn't that extraordinary when we consider that he was born the ordinary peasant way. Some artists are now depicting Mary giving birth in a more human, biologically accurate, and realistic way than what hyper-Marian piety would allow in previous generations. Still, as heroic as the intentions are behind these new art pieces, they still tend to romanticize in ways ethnocentric to 21st century Western culture. For one thing, Joseph would not really be present at the birth, but every woman in the house would be. The weakest emotional bond throughout the ancient circum-Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultural worlds was that between husband and wife. The reason was that marriages in this cultural world were arranged. Beside that, this was a fiercely gender-divided world. Even in a cramped space, men and women don't sleep together except on rare and brief occasions. Romantic ideas terribly distort Bible reading. When you add in Christmassy feels, the rest is history. What Luke is describing in chapter 2 is not a barn or stables out back operated by a first century hotel. Our Christmas observances have mixed into a cake batter various contradictory details from the Matthean infancy narrative and the Lucan infancy narrative. These stories were never meant to be jumbled together this way. They cannot be harmonized reasonably. In Matthew's story of Jesus' infancy, no reason is given for why Joseph and Mary are found in Bethlehem at the beginning of the story at the time of Jesus' birth. Since the text lacks any geographical transitions, Matthew doesn't mention any starting off, and given that neither Matthew nor his audience knew the gospel called Luke, which hadn't even been written yet, and because Matthew mentions Joseph's house in Bethlehem, given what we know about the patrilocality of first century Israelite homes and a host of other related issues, it should be clear that the author we call Matthew presents Joseph and Mary as being natives of Bethlehem, and only later on, following a trip into Egypt, moved to Nazareth to escape the Herods. In other words, the author called Matthew communicates that Mary and Joseph had never been to Nazareth before. Friends, the different gospel writers were embarrassed of Jesus' Galilean origins in nothing place Nazareth, a tiny little hamlet filled with nothing people. And this was Matthew's clever fix. Luke, on the other hand, who never read Matthew, states that Joseph and Mary are from Nazareth, but come to Bethlehem to be enrolled. This may imply that Joseph had land there, since the census or enrollment was for land taxation purposes. And if Joseph had land there, or was tied to land there, then he must have had extended kin living there. If so, he would have been obligated to stay with his extended family, not in a commercial inn. Bethlehem was a small village only a 2-hour walk from Jerusalem. We know almost certainly that it had no commercial inns, considered by first century Israelites to be unclean places. If close family was not available, all Joseph would have to do is mention his lineage, and that would have resulted in immediate village recognition that he belonged, and space in a home would have been made available. While the Greek word in Luke chapter 2 verse 7 can sometimes mean inn, it normally refers to a large furnished room attached to a peasant house, and is best translated guest room. Only other use of this term in the New Testament is in the story of the Last Supper, where it is translated upper room. The normal word for a commercial inn is used by Luke at chapter 10 verse 34, Such an inn was a place that receives all, and therefore was notoriously dirty, according to Israelite standards. So let's forget inns, hotels, and bed and breakfast. Luke wasn't talking about that. There was no place for Joseph and Mary in the guest room of extended kin. Why? Well, the fact that there was no place for Joseph and Mary in the guest room of the home meant that someone who socially outranked them already occupied it. In the Mediterranean agrarian society of the Gospel according to Luke, all the village women, mothers, aunts, sisters, etc., raised the boys and girls together, but only until the age of puberty. All families in the Bible are Mediterranean, and the strongest emotional bond in the Mediterranean family is that between mother and eldest son. This emotional bond gives the mother enormous power over her son's life, all the way through adulthood. Recall Rebekah's manipulative meddling into the lives of her adult sons, Jacob and Esau. Another consequence is that boys who approach the age of puberty are invariably spoiled. Remember, sons are the mother's social security in their old age, in this culture. Because Mediterranean boys are highly valued in this culture, all Mediterranean women pamper and pleasure them. For instance, in the Mediterranean world of the Gospels, boys are breastfed twice as long as girls, even long after he is able to speak. When he asks for food, he is immediately fed. This is his experience. Certainly, Jesus and all other Israelite boys, and all other Mediterranean boys, would inescapably conclude from this experience that his every word to women is like law. This is how it went for all circum-Mediterranean and Middle Eastern peoples for at least 4,000 years. A third consequence of raising boys and girls together to the nearly total exclusion of the father and other men during this nurturing process is that Mediterranean boys like Jesus enter puberty with an ambiguous identity. You see, because he had no male role model up to that point, he would not know how to be a man. At puberty, the first century Israelite boy is unceremoniously shoved out of the comfort and pleasures of the Garden of Eden, woman's world, into the harsh and hierarchical violence of the men's world. Now all the men teach the adolescent his proper place and behavior. Often, this was accomplished by brutal physical punishings and beatings, which he is taught must be suffered in silence, without retaliation, without complaint. Certainly Jesus, and all the males he knew in his life, would have experienced this. And so also he would naturally conclude, as would all the male peers of his life, that such stoic suffering is one way of demonstrating manliness. In fact, haunted by Mediterranean gender ambiguity, the Middle Eastern North African Jesus and all his male peers would inescapably strive for Mediterranean hyper-ethnomasculinity, as recalled in the Passion narratives and really throughout the Gospels. Therefore, whenever reading this Gospel story found only in Luke about the 12-year-old Jesus at the temple, it is best read illuminated by this Mediterranean cultural backdrop. Why did Jesus' parents not notice that Jesus was missing until after a day's journey in the homeward direction north to Galilee? The adolescent Jesus was probably still in the severe Mediterranean process of transition into male adulthood. In the caravans, Israelites, like all Mediterranean and Middle Eastern peoples, traveled according to the gender divisions that permeated their society. Men and boys past the age of puberty traveled together. Women, girls, and prepubescent boys traveled together. By the way, did I mention the weakest emotional bond in Jesus' cultural world? That would be that between spouses. Marriages in this world are arranged, you see. and women and men, even married, live in very different worlds. Joseph probably sighed when he discovered that Jesus was absent from the company of men. Likely, he concluded that Jesus was still struggling with his transition from women's company and ran back to its Edenic comforts. In contrast, Mary may have proudly, if wistfully, believed that Jesus at last was with the men, as would be appropriate for a lad of his age. Only after a day's journey, when Jesus could not be found among male or female relatives and friends, did his family realize he was not in the caravan at all. When Americans of any stripe, Christians included, read Luke chapter 2, verse 41 to 52, so much romantic nonsense gets read into the text. Folks, we need to read these stories respectfully. And the first reading of the Gospels is Mediterranean culture. Last time we spoke about how Mary and Joseph lost their teenage son, Jesus. Now let's turn to when Jesus is finally found, according to the Gospel called Luke. Two things emerge from the Lucan report. First, the 12-year-old Jesus is meeting with an adult group of men, teachers, in the temple, and giving evidence of intelligent understanding. The author we know as Luke therefore indicates that Jesus has successfully made the transition into the adult male world. But the transition has other consequences that are evident in Jesus' dialogue with his mother, Mary. Look at Mary and how she reproaches her son. There's some personal irritation there. Son, why have you treated us like this? That's perfectly understandable. After all, isn't Jesus supposed to begin to behave like a responsible adult male? Obviously, he failed to inform Joseph, Mary, and all his friends and relatives about his intention, staying behind in the temple. In this group-oriented culture, such independent and individualistic behavior is irresponsible, disrespectful, and shameful. Please don't forget that the author we know as Luke, though he is an elite, is not an American. He's not a 21st century Western individualist. In his creating this story, he is bringing out something about the holy man Jesus. Then look at Jesus' response. You could hardly call it respectful. Did you not know? But that's equally understandable too. Something missing in the English is that the verb know Luke uses is plural. This indicates that Jesus is not only reproaching Mary, but also Joseph. Male maturity in the Mediterranean cultural world entails becoming liberated from the female control. A Mediterranean man, and that would include also Israelites like Jesus, wrestles throughout life with the tension between leaving female company behind, yet continuing to nurture the strong bond with his mother, which is, by the way, again, the strongest emotional bond in the circum-Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultural worlds. Struggling now to trade his mother's tutelage for Joseph's, the Lucan Jesus is irritated by Mary's reproach. How do we explain Jesus' reproach to Joseph? One explanation is that he failed to keep a closer eye and stronger control over Jesus as an adolescent eager to take his rightful place in his appropriate, controlling, all-male group. Did Joseph not care enough about him? It is hard to raise children in any culture. It's never been easy. Sometimes the only thing that parents can do is to ponder the mystery and hope that the child will continue growing up into wisdom, maturity, and favor among human beings and holy and absolute mystery we call God.
Would it be fairly safe to say that in any kind of a conversation, a Korean and American might misunderstand each other because of cultural difference? Given the kind of travel that we all do now, a lot of us have experienced that kind of thing. Even simple things can be misunderstood because we come from a different cultural background. What hasn't dawned on us is there's no difference between my talking to a person in another culture and my reading the writings of a person from a different culture. All of the capacity we have to misunderstand in oral speech, we also have in reading the writings of people who are not Westerners, don't have the cultural outlook we do. All right, honor. Honor is relatively simple, actually, to understand. Honor is your standing in the pecking order of the village, together with the public recognition of that. There is no such thing as claiming honor that the village does not recognize. To claim honor that the village does not recognize is to be uppity, brash, a braggart, a fool. Honor is public reputation in the village, and everybody in the village knows exactly where you stand in the pecking order. The reason for that is there are two primary ways in which you can get your honor rating or ranking in a village. The overwhelming way in which you get your honor rating is what it is from your birth. It's what anthropologists call ascribed honor. It's the honor that you get the day you pop out of the womb. It's the honor that you and every member of your extended family has, male and female, everybody in your family has always had, and always will have. That kind of ascribed honor means that if you are born in a very high family, you have a high honor ranking. If you are born a low life, you have a low honor ranking. And you're probably going to have it till the day you die. So the overwhelming way in which you get your honor is from the family of your birth. Do you now understand why genealogies are so important in the Bible? Genealogies indicate in writing what a village knows orally, namely the family you were born in, and hence the honor ranking you have. I spent some time living in the little Palestinian village of Beit Jala on the West Bank. Doing research, my primary area of interest is peasant studies. And in living in Beit Jala, I discovered that when I would be introduced to peasants, they would often immediately tell me their genealogy. For most peasants, it's only 3 generations long. Me, my father, and my grandfather. Maybe my son. Maybe 4. Sometimes in an oral setting like that, they will go back and add the eponymous ancestors of the community, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Genealogies are, if you will, a kind of a map for the whole community, describing exactly where in the scheme of things you fit. Among non-literate people, which in antiquity was about 96% of the population, among non-literate people, genealogies would be very short. Only upper-class, wealthy people had written genealogies. And you understand that the longer the genealogy, the better, because it means you're from old money, not new money. You understand? Anybody curious why only 2 of our Gospels have genealogies for Jesus? Matthew and Luke provided genealogy, Mark and John do not. What I find interesting is the one in Luke. It goes all the way back to son of Seth, son of Adam, son of God. That is, it traces it to the beginning. That's the longest genealogy possible. Do you understand that an honor claim is being made? In fact, we know from Roman texts that people in the Roman world who did become newly rich and wanted to move up the social ladder hired genealogists to create fictive genealogies for themselves. And there were a few stars in the pantheon of Roman ancestors they all wanted to be associated with. For a fee, you could get that association. Now you have the map that tells everybody where you fit in the pecking order of things, and that has an enormous impact on your life. Your honor ranking determined who ate with whom, who could marry whom, who spoke to whom, who listened to whom. It determined who would speak first in a conversation. It determined who would marry whom and who would do business with whom. In fact, it determined most of the social patterns of your life. It's therefore critically important that everybody in the village know exactly where you stand, because it provides the roadmap for how you and I are going to interact with each other. So, for right now, the overwhelming way in which you are going to get your honor ranking is from your birth, ascribed honor.
Once upon a time, not too long ago, a university employee and graduate student, who by the way now happens to be a high-ranking member of the Southern Baptist Convention, attended Mass at a nearby Catholic parish. I should say that this person was energetically anti-Catholic. He had entered the liturgy with the sole purpose of obtaining a consecrated host for a special purpose. It was toward the end of the Mass when this fellow entered the church. He quietly got into a communion line. Once in front of the extraordinary minister of communion, he received the host on the tongue, as he had watched people do on EWTN many times. Then, without swallowing, he quietly and quickly exited the building and got into his car. From the glove compartment, he quickly took out a prepared Ziploc bag and spit the host into it. He sealed the bag. A biology major and creationist, besides, this man drove to the university and placed the semi-dissolved host on a petri dish. He next began to observe the material through a microscope. His preconceived idea was confirmed. It was carbohydrates only. In a great bombast of triumphalism, the next day he celebrated his sacrilege to his fellow Christian collegians. "I knew it all along," he exclaimed gleefully. "This disproves the false doctrine of the real presence. The physical substance is nothing but bread." For any Protestant fundamentalists listening to this story, I want to ask you some questions. First, what do you think? Was the anti-Catholic right? Did he really disprove Catholic teaching? By the way, like all Christian fundamentalists, the anti-Catholic in the story firmly believes that every human person has a soul. Do you believe that? What if we extracted blood from this man, or from you, and put it under a microscope? Would we rightly say that this man and you have no soul, because clearly all we see inside the blood inside of you is just physical matter? This anti-Catholic who committed the sacrilege in the church also believes in God. He believes that God is a sovereign God, one who controls every aspect of the universe. Likewise, he believes the risen and ascended Jesus is God and Lord over all creation. Imagine we use a space telescope to look out deep into the cosmos. After scanning the heavens, when we fail to see the literal face of God out there, should we conclude that God is just a fantasy and that Christ is a lie? The man who stole the host believes that Jesus' resurrection was not only a bodily reality, but is a physical reality also. And thus, he believes that the ascension was literal space travel. When we inform him that we cannot find the risen Jesus by space telescope, nor pinpoint his trajectory and velocity, should he then repudiate Christianity? This anti-Catholic scientist, despite being a biology major, holds dearly that the planet Earth and universe are only a few thousand years old. To believe in creation means to believe in creationism. So what if we use solid science to demonstrate the absurdity of his beliefs? Should he then cease believing and become an atheist? Because, after all, his creationist beliefs have failed to match reality. Let's be logically consistent with this man. Now, I know that not only are there fundamentalist Protestants listening to this story, there are also Catholic fundamentalists listening to this story. So I want to address them and ask them some questions. For my Catholic fundamentalist brothers and sisters, having listened to this tragically sad story, how do you understand the Church's chosen adverbs truly, really, and substantially, used to describe the real presence of Jesus in official teaching on the Eucharist?
Let's say, typical of many Catholic fundamentalists, you insist that substance in the Church's teaching on the real presence means a physical chemical substance. Well, what happened then with the anti-Catholics' experiment? What happens to your faith? Do you, as a Catholic, believe that at the words of consecration spoken by a validly ordained priest or bishop celebrating the Mass, that a physical and chemical transformation occurs in the bread and wine? Do you believe that real presence and transubstantiation represent a real physical change in the host? But look at the experiment by this man who committed the sacrilege. If that gets disproven, what then becomes of your faith? The official Catholic teaching on the Eucharist is heavily indebted to Thomas Aquinas, who spoke about the possibility of Eucharistic wonders, sometimes anachronistically called Eucharistic miracles. Such wonders fascinate many Catholics today. They are brought up ad nauseum every Corpus Christi in train wreck homilies given throughout the Archdiocese of Miami, in sunny South Florida, always excellent at spiritual abuse and pooling ignorance. Aquinas says that if God wanted to, God could manifest a real physical change in the consecrated elements at Mass. For instance, Aquinas claims that God could physically or chemically change the material structure of the host into blood, or heart tissue, or the appearance of a recognizable face. But according to Aquinas, even in such wondrous cases, even in such marvels, the blood and flesh manifested on the altar there could not be the real properties of the risen Jesus, because the real Jesus bleeds no more. Given all that, what becomes of your Eucharistic beliefs? I want to talk seriously for a moment about the faith, so-called faith, of fundamentalists, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, or of any religious tradition. Think about this story. If you do that, you should get something fundamental about all fundamentalists. You know what they are? They're really just scratch-off atheists. Recalling the crime that the man did in the church, wouldn't it be a sacrilege to go through life misusing apologetics to prove into metaphysical certitude your faith? Wouldn't it be a sacrilege to call yourself a Christian and a believer when you're really just a rationalist, an atheist in disguise and self-denial? Isn't it sacrilege to confuse faith with certitude? To distort the reasonable with the rational? Fundamentalism, like most silly versions of atheism, not all atheism is silly, but silly versions of atheism, which are by far the most common. Fundamentalism is a rationalistic approach to faith, just like silly atheism. But faith is reasonable, not rational. Faith is reasonable to the extent that it is not absurd to believe, and indeed it makes good sense to believe. It's convincing, it's life transformative in a healing way. Faith is reasonable to the extent that accepting Christ is not renunciation of the intellect. So it's reasonable in that we can show that life in Christ is more meaningful than life without Him. But faith is not rational, provable through reason or logic alone. Faith cannot be proven through reason alone. Faith is not as if an unprejudiced observer, under the impact of your logical arguments, would be forced to mentally assent to it, otherwise violate her own integrity. This is what many popular Catholic authors, speakers, and so-called apologists would have us believe. They perennially present revelation and faith as achievable through reason alone. You don't need any supernatural help from God. They make the conviction of faith into a natural act. But the Second Council of Orange condemned their position in 529 Common Era. People who seek to defend the faith should get the fundamentals concerning apologetics right. Real apologetics is that branch of theology, the critical reflection of faith, that shows the faith to be reasonable or not absurd. Moreover, real apologetics shows belief and life in Christ to be convincing, relevant, and inviting. But what it never does is attempt to prove to metaphysical certitude the truths of the faith, or demean and denigrate as stupid or diabolic other faith traditions. To do either of these things is something other than apologetics or evangelization, namely the machinations of proselytism, brainwashing, getting people to be shaken in their present faith commitments and join us. Ask a fundamentalist Catholic to explain what proofs mean to Thomas Aquinas, such as in his famous 5 proofs. Quite likely the response you'll get will present something alien to what Aquinas actually had in mind. My friends, in the next few videos, we will look at fundamentalists on both sides of the Tiber River and how they have made a hot mess concerning belief in Jesus' resurrection.